My name's Alexander Rose. I'm the executive director of the Long Now Foundation based in San Francisco. And I hope you're also ready for a talk that is not at all about e-commerce or the digital world, really. And I'm going to start my talk with a story, and it's actually the story that got the Long Now Foundation started. It was a story that was told by one of our founders, Stewart Brand, who had founded the Whole Earth Catalog, to a computer scientist named Danny Hillis, who had been designing some of the fastest supercomputers in the world with his company, Thinking Machines. And the story is about the beams that are in this drawing, and those beams that were put up at New College, Oxford, were put up in the 1200s when the New College was new. And it wasn't until 500 years later when they inspected these beams and they found that some of them had become rotted and they need to be replaced. But it was actually very difficult in Europe now in the 1800s to replace oak beams that were anywhere near this size. And they didn't quite know what to do, and it wasn't until they spoke to the school forester, and the school forester said, oh, well, we have the trees that you planted. And it turns out that when they built the school in the 1200s, they also planted a grove of oak trees so that when those beams needed to be replaced, they could replace them with those trees. And it was this kind of thinking that Danny Hillis, this computer scientist, realized was not going on at all in modern society, and certainly not in the modern digital society that we are now living in, where speed was valued above all else. And Stewart Brand, who had told him this story, who had in turn heard it from Gregory Bateson, he realized that there was some kind of balancing corrective needed as well. And so they started a conversation, and Danny Hillis proposed the idea of building a monument-scale, multi-millennial mechanical clock as an icon to long-term thinking. And Stewart Brand thought that that would be a really great way to get people's attention, but what do you do with that attention once you have it? You need to have a kind of an information storage service or a library that could also last on that millennial timescale. And several of the other people who were part of this conversation came together as our founding board, including Brian Eno, who coined this term, the long now. When he had moved from Europe to New York, he realized that in New York, when people said now, they meant the 5 minutes that we're in, not the time that we are in. So we adopted this term for our foundation, and really we actually stretched that even further by looking at the kind of civilizational moment that we're in. The last 10,000 years is really how long we have been adapting our planet more than us adapting to it. And so if we consider ourselves in the middle of a 20,000-year story, at the beginning of the next 10,000 years, rather than at the end of a 10,000-year story, how would we act differently towards the world? What kind of companies, what kind of things would we build in that case? And in order to help think about this, I made this diagram working with Brian Eno and Stewart Brand. One of the first things that we worked on is to kind of figure out, how do you know when you're acting kind of irresponsibly towards the future? And it's this idea of having several case layers to human civilization, and the fastest and most frenetic being on the outside in fashion and art, and the slowest moving one being nature on the inside. And as an example, if, for instance, you're cutting down trees in the Pacific Northwest of the United States that take 1,000 years to grow, and you're cutting them down at a commercial scale, you have skipped 3 layers of this diagram. And it's a good way to know that you are not acting responsibly towards the future. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects of the Long Now Foundation, one being the clock, and that's the one that I'm most involved in, and then a couple other ones towards the end, and then hopefully actually tie this, at least tentatively, to electronic commerce. Over the last 17 years of working on this project, I've been amassing examples of what I call the millennial precedent. Things that have been designed to last for over 1,000 years or have accidentally lasted for over 1,000 years as ways to learn lessons from how you build something to last for a very, very long time. One of the examples is the Antikythera device, which is over 2,000 years old. It was found in a shipwreck off of Antikythera, Greece. And just very recently, it was rediscovered in a way of using modern technology of CAT scans and X-rays so that it could be rebuilt. And we now know that it was a very advanced astronomical clock. And so as a builder of a clock that's supposed to last for several thousand years, this gives me hope that even if the clock gets lost at the bottom of the ocean, when you pull it back up, if the right people find it and they take the care to look at it, they might understand what exactly we were trying to do. And this is the reason, for instance, why we would want to use mechanics rather than an electronic thing. When that LCD screen goes blank, there's not really much for you to do with that clock 1,000 years from now. The other interesting principle that comes up, and this is used in nature a lot, is the idea of sacrifice. Such as a lizard losing its tail. The lizard lives on another day by losing some part of it that the predator thinks is the valuable part. Now, this has happened in some cases, like the outer casing stones of the pyramids at Giza were taken, but we still have the pyramids. In the Taj Mahal, it was lined with jewels all the way throughout, and instead of destroying the building the last time it was sacked, it was actually, people spent a long time prying all these jewels away, and they felt as though they had taken all the value from this that they could, but really the value was in the building itself, and so the building still stands. Another tactic that does seem to work is just being extremely remote. This is the global seed vault in Svalbard. It's about 800 miles north of the Arctic Circle. This is what the airport looks like as you approach. It is about as remote a place on Earth as you can imagine. It was designed to be a backup of the world's crop seeds for the next 1,000 years. And what was most interesting to me about visiting this place was not really the seed vault itself. It's just a big underground bunker full of boxes of seeds. But was this sign-in book, is that I was signing my name right after Ban Ki-moon and a congressional delegation and dignitaries from around the world, and that by being remote, it's not only does it take it out of the danger of being in cities, but it also makes it much more evocative, and people really wanted to go visit this thing as far away as it was. Another interesting tactic to make something last for a very long time is just to take a really, really long time to build it. Here in Europe, this is the cathedral at Cologne. It took over 600 years to build. By the time it was done, it was already an antique. And it was already, now we have examples here in Spain of a building that's 125 years into its construction. It's nowhere near complete, yet it's already a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the most dangerous time, it turns out, for something to last for a very long time is just 1 or 2 generations after it started. And even the Gaudi Cathedral had a kind of a dangerous time when it wasn't new and it wasn't yet an old antique and valued for its cultural value. So we want to be able to, so one way to do this is just take, by the time, if you take 600 years to build something, you're already old. The other one is just to maintain it, and Japan is famous for this. These are considered the oldest continuously standing wooden structures in the world. They were built in the 700s. They also have a set of temples near here which are rebuilt every 20 years and have been so since the 600s. So if you have an institution that is willing to make sure the roof doesn't leak and maintains the object, that's also another way to make something last for a long time. But much more difficult to design an institution to last for 10,000 years. Building things underground seems to be the new trend. This is a picture of the 100,000-year nuclear waste repository outside of Helsinki. And in the United States, we have a congressional mandate for 10,000 years of storing nuclear waste, so they're building 10,000 to 100,000-year structures right now. And the last one I'll talk about is ideology. It's one of the most dangerous things to do over the very long term, in the sense, is to choose a side, because then you can be a loser of that side. And in this case, this is a before and after picture of the Buddha's Bamyan in Afghanistan, which I can't really imagine a more innocuous symbol of an ideology than a Buddha, but it was considered threatening enough to the Taliban that they spent many weeks blasting these massive Buddhas out of the wall in Bamiyan. So it's always dangerous to have ideology. Now we do, our idea is long-term thinking. So we don't know also what people will ascribe to the value of this, but we have to be careful of, for instance, not trying to create a religion. So I'm going to talk about the clock project that I work on most closely now, and what we started with was a set of design principles that we measured all other machines like this against, and most of them are very self-explanatory. The longevity, maintainability, we wanted to be transparent so that if you found it, just like the Antikythera device, you could understand how it worked. Evolvability, so if we have things like the calendar system in our clock, you want to be able to evolve that in the future. And scalability, in our case, so that we could make some small prototypes and work our way up to the monument scale version that we hoped to build as we started this. And so I'm just going to show you one kind of design problem that we had to solve while working on the clock. It's represented by this time-lapse picture of where the sun is at high noon throughout the course of the year. It's called the analemma. And because of the Earth's elliptical orbit, it creates this shape if you take a picture of the sun at high noon throughout the year. Normally this would not matter to clocks, but in our clock, the way that we keep it from drifting time-wise is that we have a thing that focuses some sunlight at the top of the mountain onto a piece of metal that expands and gives us a mechanical trigger and says, this is solar noon. So we have a clock that's tracking solar noon. But we also have a pendulum that's ticking, keeping with track of absolute time, or mechanical time. And that varies by plus or minus 15 minutes throughout the course of the year. And so if you were trying to synchronize absolute time to solar time, you could be wrong, you could be synchronizing the clock incorrectly. Now, there's been clocks that have solved this problem before for a year at a time. But in the clock that we're building, we have to make this work for 10,000 years. So there's another effect that the Earth is going through is a wobbling on its axes every 26,000 years called the precession. And then it's also changing its rotational rate by almost a second a century right now. All of those things come into play if you want to synchronize solar time to absolute time in a clock like ours. And so in our clock, we have this one cam that is that changing equation over 10,000 years. We added 1,000 years on the beginning and end, so you'd have a little time to make a new cam if you needed to. So you read this cam once a year, and then the arm goes up at once every 10,000 years, giving you the difference between the two. We also had to solve the decamillennium bug, which was coming up on us in about 8,000 years, so we had to add an extra digit to the date. And as I said, we were building in scale. So we started by building a small scale version. This is a picture of the first clock prototype that we built. It's at the Science Museum in London now. But now we're scaling up very, very large. The project that we're currently working on is funded by Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And we've been working on it since 2005. This is the site. It's in West Texas. We've already done about 80% of the excavation on the project. You can see at the bottom of these cliffs here, a little bit of the dirt coming out of the excavation going on. But basically we wanted to build underground, take that principle, but we also wanted to use techniques that were not yet available in mining. We had to kind of invent them. And so we borrowed some technology from Carrara, Italy, where they use these diamond belt saws. And we designed a 27,000-pound, three-joint articulated robot to cut stairs where every single cut would be different. And then you break the rock out between and you create stairs. So this was the idea. And just recently, we started cutting. And this machine has been cutting for the last year. Cuts through rock about as fast as you might see a chainsaw cut through wood. And these were the first test stairs that we did. So after you make all those cuts, you break out all the rock plates and clean it up a little bit. And now we have over 100 vertical feet of stairs like this. And all of that is just the place to house the clock, where you're walking around through a 500-foot vertical tunnel. And the clock itself is now under construction. I can't show you finished pictures of the whole thing because we're not done. But this gives you an idea. It has most of the same things normal clocks do. One of the big differences is that we have to store power, for instance, for over a century, and that it has this solar synchronizer in it. We also have one of the largest machines in it is a chime generator that can ring a series of 10 bells in a different sequence each day for 10,000 years. But today I'm going to show you one part of it, which is the power system. The power system gathers energy from the temperature difference from day to night, as well as the visitors who wind it. So the clock keeps time just from the temperature difference from day to night. So it always knows what time it is. But the dials don't move and the chimes don't ring unless someone is there to wind it all the way up. So we had to work at a very large scale and with materials that could last over this time scale. And so we worked with our main structural material is stainless steel. All the axles are titanium, and most importantly, all the bearings, the roller bearings in the clock are made of all ceramic material so that the entire clock can operate with no lubrication at all. And even the teeth of the gears themselves are three-dimensionally cut so that they're always in rolling friction, never in sliding friction. And this video is just from fairly recently, and we're just now probably about 50% done with the mechanical build of the clock itself. These two items would be stacked on top of each other underground in that space where the stairs would be. So that's the clock project. That's where it is at right now. The other two projects that I'm just going to briefly mention is one about reviving extinct species, and then the other one is about saving extinct languages. A while ago, we started this project called Revive and Restore that is trying to use genetic engineering to revive extinct species. Over the last 10,000 years, humans have been responsible for pretty much every animal extinction we know of, and we now have the technology, and in fact, one of the first reviving of extinct species that ever has occurred of a large mammal happened here in Spain. It's not very well reported. Maybe some of you know about it, but it was a mountain goat that they had just gotten the eggs and the sperm from the last two survivors when the last one was killed by a tree. They were able to bring back another one. It only lived for a few minutes after being born, but it was kind of a concept proof. So this is happening whether or not we know it, or whether or not we want it to. And the question was, should there be an ethical framework around it? Should we be thinking about bringing back species that do have a habitat to come back to? And the first two species that we were working with are the passenger pigeon, which we're actually in the middle of genetically sequencing it, and then George Church at Harvard is very interested in actually bringing back the mammoth and is coming very far along the line of basically being able to synthesize a mammoth out of a modern Asian elephant. And then storing information. If you wanted to store information for 10,000 years and records of culture, how would you do it? You could take the example of the Rosetta Stone itself, which is what we did, and we realized that if you want to do that in parallel, that kind of parallel text technology that the Rosetta Stone did, but you want to do it with all the languages in the world, you have to do it much smaller and with have a lot more materials than just the Rosetta Stone did. It took over 50 years to decode that. So we collected language materials from all over the world, and we micro-etched them using silicon wafer technology and then plated that into a nickel disk that could last for several thousand years. And this disk has over 13,500 pages in 1,200 different languages represented. And over 10 years ago, we were asked by the ESA to donate one to the ESA's Rosetta mission. At the time, we had no idea if it was going to be a success or even launch. And of course, it did, and just this last week, we had some great news about it, but our disk is not on the lander, but it is on the orbiter, which will probably continue to orbit the sun for the next several thousand or million years, so we'll see. So that's a quick overview of some of the projects of the Long Now Foundation. We have several more, and we may talk about long bets as well, but I just wanted to leave you with this one thought. you are all creating the new economy with your companies. When Jeff Bezos went public with Amazon, he started it with this statement: it's all about the long term. And he now attaches that original letter that when they went public, to every single quarterly stock report, and to remind people that when he built the company, he built it to last for decades, and that you have to be willing to be misunderstood for decades if you're actually going to invent new things. And so I hope that all of you, while I know that it's very easy to work in the now, think about stretching that now a little bit further, because you're not just creating your own company, you're creating the world that we will live in the next 10, 20, and 100 years. Thank you.
Seguro que no esperabais una presentación así. ¿A cuántos de vosotros os ha sorprendido la presentación? O sea, que todos estos que dicen preguntas, entiendo. ¿Hay alguien que quiera hacer alguna pregunta? Vamos, animaros. ¿No? No te lo puedo creer. Well, I have a question for you. You mentioned before, you have this project called Long Bets. People pay for making predictions. Am I right? That's right. Is there any of those predictions who have become a reality?
Yeah, we've actually had to, so long bets is this idea where you can bet on things of scientific or social consequence over...
And you pay for it. I mean,
yes,
you have to pay for making that deal.
It's bets for money. And since in the United States it's illegal to do that kind of betting for money, we take the money in as a charity, and then the winner chooses the charity of the winners of their choice to where that money goes to. So nobody profits from it. But we have bets as large as $1 million from Warren Buffett about the way the markets will work, and but for $50 you can log your own prediction, and then someone can take the other side of that prediction. I think one of the more interesting ones we have right now is between Ray Kurzweil and Mitch Kapor about when a computer will pass the Turing test, or the human intelligence test. And Ray Kurzweil has reported that would be, I think, in 2028. And so we're coming up on it. Let's see what happens.
Okay. Pregunta, Nacho.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Just one question. The way we are handling the planet and the way we are handling our own human race, it seems that we will kill each other in a very closer time. I mean, we won't last 10,000 years. Are you doing anything to preserve human life in the long term?
Well, one might think that the revive and restore technology could be used for that. I think the main thing that this project brought to me was a level of hope. I think that people get very dire messages about the future, whether it be climate change or wars. But the reality is there's very few truly existential threats to humanity. Possibly a comet hitting Earth is one of them. All of the other ones might reduce the carrying capacity of the Earth or might reduce the number of people, but I don't think any of them actually eliminate people. So the question is if we're going to live in that world, what do we want it to be like? Are we creating more choices for the future, or are we taking choices away?
¿Alguna preguntas? No.
One over here.
¿Dónde? Where? Ah, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Does that scientific community support your projects?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The scientific community, the scientists, support your projects. I mean, what they think about this?
You're asking if the scientific community supports our projects?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, the ones where we work most closely is the Revive and Restore project, but I mentioned George Church, who invented the CRISPR technology for for genetic sequencing, and Beth Novak out of UC Santa Cruz. There's pretty much all of these labs around the world that are already doing this kind of technology. It's all kind of trailing edge technology off of human reproduction science. And so they're trying to figure out, in some cases, just how to, if there's only 9 northern white rhinos left in the world, all 9 of them are non-viable to breed together. They're brother, sister, all equal. So there has to be some genetic engineering just to even get a nearly extinct species into a viable population as well. So we're going to be doing this, and the question is, how should we be thinking about it as a civilization?
This statement in this near real-time economy, thinking about the long term is really fresh air. Just, this is not a question, just a comment. You told about that you saw the millennium bug in your clock, but you really postponed it for 98,000 years.
I'm sorry, I'm not following your question.
It's not a question, it's really a joke. It's about the millennium bug.
Right.
You didn't solve it, you postponed it for a long time.
Yes.
1 order of magnitude.
Well, yeah, until 100,000 years.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
98,000.
That's the evolvability.
Great.
Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you. My name's Alexander Rose. I'm the executive director of the Long Now Foundation based in San Francisco. And I hope you're also ready for a talk that is not at all about e-commerce or the digital world, really. And I'm going to start my talk with a story, and it's actually the story that got the Long Now Foundation started. It was a story that was told by one of our founders, Stewart Brand, who had founded the Whole Earth Catalog, to a computer scientist named Dan. But what do you do with that attention once you have it? You need to have a kind of an information storage service or a library that could also last on that millennial timescale. And several of the other people who were part of this conversation came together as our founding board, including Brian Eno, who coined this term, the long now. When he had moved from Europe to New York, he realized that in New York, when people said now, they meant the 5 minutes that we're in, not the time that we are in. So we adopted this term for our foundation, and really we actually stretched that even further. Place oak beams that were anywhere near this size. And they didn't quite know what to do, and it wasn't until they spoke to the school forester, and the school forester said, oh, well, we have the trees that you planted. And it turns out that when they built the school in the 1200s, they also planted a grove of oak trees so that when those beams needed to be replaced, they could replace them with those trees. And it was this kind of thinking that Danny Hillis, this computer scientist, realized was not going on at all in modern society, and certainly not Danny Hillis, who had been designing some of the fastest supercomputers in the world with his company, Thinking Machines. And the story is about the beams that are in this drawing, and those beams that were put up at New College, Oxford, were put up in the 1200s when the New College was new. And it wasn't until 500 years later when they inspected these beams and they found that some of them had become rotted and they need to be replaced. But it was actually very difficult in Europe now in the 1800s to replace in the modern digital society that we are now living in, where speed was valued above all else. And Stewart Brand, who had told him this story, who had in turn heard it from Gregory Bateson, he realized that there was some kind of balancing corrective needed as well. And so they started a conversation, and Danny Hillis proposed the idea of building a monument-scale, multi-millennial mechanical clock as an icon to long-term thinking. And Stewart Brand thought that that would be a really great way to get people's attention